Hi, everyone. My name is Hampton, and I'm a current PhD student here in the department, and I have the distinct honor of welcoming you all, whether virtually or in person, to the fall 2021 History, Theory, and Criticism lecture at the MIT School of Architecture. Before introducing our speaker, just a few words to kind of orient us in this space. First and foremost, MIT acknowledges Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory. And we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. I also just wanted to foreground that there will be a question and answer session following the talk. I'll be moderating, but as those of you in person entered, you were given an index card. These will be used for the question and answer period. For both in-person attendees and online viewers can post questions that will then be transcribed onto cards by our staff. Those physically present, please just jot down any questions you have throughout the presentation, and we have a staff member that will come by and pick them up. And now it is my distinct privilege to introduce our speaker, Diana Martinez, who is currently an assistant professor and director of architectural studies at Tufts University. Martinez completed her doctorate in architectural history from Columbia University in 2016, where she wrote her dissertation and forthcoming book, Concrete Colonialism, Architecture, Infrastructure, Urbanism, and the American Colonization of the Philippines, which I think we all look forward to seeing in book form soon. Her scholarship has been published or is forthcoming in Architectural Theory Review, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, the Avery Review, and Aggregate, all of which feature an interest in understanding and interrogating the intimacies and entanglements of American empire, architecture, and the Philippines. Please join me in welcoming Diana Martinez for her talk, The Architecture of a Legitimation Crisis, America's Gift of Freedom to the Philippines.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Hampton. And I also want to thank Aidan Flynn and Kathleen Brearley for all the organizational labor, and to Hampton and the rest of the HTC group for the invitation. You will notice I did make a change to the title of my talk. Just a quick note on the my use of the term decolonial. I went back and forth about it, as my usage of the term is anachronistic. While mostly associated with Latinx scholarship and activism, the term decolonial was actually first coined at the Bandung Conference in 1955. Introduced at the crest of a wave of decolonization that took place between 1945 and 1960, decolonial thinking sought avenues beyond the horizon of the nation state and towards the prospect of a decolonial world order. The architecture I will present tonight was not envisioned as a decolonial architecture, so I just want to make that clear, but was rather an architecture that was intended to both play a role in and to represent a stable process of decolonization, a process that conveners at Bandung realized was one both imagined and brokered by former colonial powers. And it is the story of this process that I'll be illustrating today. Before I begin in earnest, a brief orientation, as this is a context that I recognize that not many people are familiar with. If anything is known about the American Colonial Project in the Philippines, it is of this, Burnham's 1905 Plan for Manila, a plan that borrowed extensively from the Macmillan Plan and served as an important precedent for Burnham's Chicago Plan. We will not be looking at Burnham's plan tonight, and though the work we will be looking at is most often thought of as an expansion of Burnham's frankly imperial project, these buildings were in fact presented to the world as evidence of a turn away from imperial forms. Though though, as will become immediately apparent, these projects were very plainly ideological cover for the massive reorganization of an Anglo-American empire. Tonight, we will be looking almost exclusively at the work of a single architect, Ralph Harrington Doane, the last American consulting architect to work in the Philippines, and as it just so happens, a graduate of MIT, the class of 1912. Those of us in Cambridge have probably already seen Doane's work in person, because following his tenure as consulting architect in the Philippines, Doane opened a practice in Cambridge. He was the architect of the Cambridge Ring and Latin School and Boston's recently revamped Motor Mart. He also did a couple apartment buildings on Beacon Street, so you probably have seen his work before without knowing it. To begin, in 1918, on the eve of his departure as the last American consulting architect to serve the Philippine Insular Government, Ralph Harrington Doane summed up his thoughts and experiences in the article Architecture in the Philippines. In it, he described the artificial stone that he developed for use in all of the monumental projects he designed during his tenure in the Philippines. And I quote, "Since the construction of genuine ashlar stone exteriors is impossible at this present time, a synthetic artificial stone has been devised comprised of granulated particles of handsome local marbles, mixed with cement in such proportions as to make the marble particles completely preponderant. The surface of this product, being tooled to expose the actual marble aggregate, produces a vibrant color tone by virtue of the exposed particles of marble, and resembles in mass the appearance of white marble or cream-warm limestone. As the manufacture of this synthetic stone is found to be somewhat analogous to the manufacture of terracotta, it is found possible to obtain without unreasonable expense an ornamentation of public buildings consistent with the standards of good taste exemplified in classic and Renaissance architecture." Once released from its formwork, Doane's artificial stone revealed the same dull gray finish as those of hundreds of utilitarian and infrastructural projects being built throughout the archipelago, including water towers, bridges, roads, culverts, dams, sewers, bodegas, and sanitary markets. It was a finish that Doane thought was inappropriate for monumental projects, not only because of its dull gray quality, but also on account of its increasing ubiquity, its industrial origins, and its already strong associations with the more prosaic functions of the insular state. In Doane's words, reinforced concrete, while structurally excellent, is artistically bastard and is the least desirable of masonry materials. Its natural color is gray and lacking in the vibrant quality capable of producing pleasurable color sensations. Furthermore, while the natural effect of time upon accepted building stones produces a weathering beneficial to their tone quality, the effect of weathering upon concrete is decidedly detrimental and results in a more unsightly and depressing aspect than is presented by the newly constructed material. What I will argue tonight is that this accusation of concrete's bastardy was far more than an expression of a contempt for the material. Born on the unconsecrated ground of a factory, concrete was incapable, Doane believed, of fulfilling the central function of the architecture he was charged with building, which was, in short, to keep a legitimation crisis at bay while the United States worked out the details of a revamped imperial order. Doane arrived to the Philippines in 1916, a full 3 years after Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And this was after sort of a continuous line of Republican presidents, basically since 1898. So it is perhaps surprising that Wilson waited so long to appoint not only Doane, but dozens of other key civil service positions in the Philippines. However, besides being preoccupied with World War I, Wilson was also reluctant to make changes in colonial governance without first fulfilling his campaign promise to pass legislation that would grant the Philippines its independence. This finally came in 1916 in the form of the Jones Law, the United States' first formal commitment to the Philippine independence. Gaining congressional approval under Wilson's persuasive influence, the preamble of the Jones Law, which is reproduced here, stated that the goal of the United States was to prepare the islanders for self-government. The Jones Law included no timeline for withdrawal. Rather, independence was contingent upon the Philippines' ability to meet a set of requirements laid out by the United States, the main criteria being the establishment of a stable government. The irony of this being, as historian Erez Manila has pointed out, that a condition of the United States leaving the Philippines was an insistence that it stay. Doan's appointment then, which came shortly after the passage of the Jones Law, was presented not as part of a colonial project, but rather as a representation of a process of withdrawal. However, on account of the particular conditions laid out in the Jones Law, the architecture had to signal a change in colonial status without signaling the full privileges of national sovereignty. Something important to note here is that Doan's appointment was unusual in that it went against the transitional policies of the Wilson administration, which in preparation for Philippine independence began to aggressively recruit Filipinos into all levels of government. This was a process called, appropriately enough, Filipinization. The process began with Wilson's direct appointment of 5 Filipinos to the legislature's upper house. This was these were positions previously occupied exclusively by Americans. And this process would be completed with the Filipinization of all civil service positions. Certainly, appointing a Filipino to top architect would have been possible, as a federal scholarship program for gifted Filipino students to study in the United States had already yielded several talented American-trained Filipino architects who were already working for the Bureau of Public Works. That the position of the consulting architect was at this particular moment reserved for an American demonstrates the perceived importance of Doan's task. Asked to render the transition to independence as an intentionally conspicuous process, Doan's architecture here would substantiate what the Jones Law framed as the United States' always noble and never self-aggrandizing intentions towards the Philippines. In order to understand the significance of Doan's charge, it is necessary to first describe some of the conditions particular to Woodrow Wilson's presidency, in addition to examining the political philosophy that so deeply influenced Wilson himself. In 1900, one of Woodrow Wilson's students at Princeton wrote to him, inquiring how the principle of self-government might apply to the United States' new possessions in the Philippines. Wilson replied that while he had not studied the question in depth, that the principle of self-government could not apply in the same manner to Americans as it did to Filipinos. Here I quote, "The consent of the governed is part of the constitutional theory which has so far been developed only or chiefly with regard to the adjustment or amendment of established systems of government. Its treatment with regard to affairs of politically undeveloped races, which have not yet learned the rudiments of self-control, has, I believe, received next to no attention. The consent of the Filipinos and the consent of the American colonists are two radically different things, not in theory, perhaps, but in practice." Not only does this communiqué offer an insight into Wilson's position regarding what he viewed as the United States' other politically undeveloped races, it also reveals Wilson's realization of the world transformational magnitude of the acquisition of the Philippines. Shortly after applying to a student, Wilson began to seriously consider the matter, addressing the problem at length in 2 articles published in The Atlantic, to which he was a frequent contributor. Wilson's entire life and career as a historian had, up until that point, focused exclusively on questions internal to the nation. What Wilson ultimately realized was that the annexation of the Philippines was not an isolated question, but rather suggested a completely altered set of relationships between the United States and the rest of the world. To this effect, Wilson observed, "We might not have seen our duty had the Philippines not fallen to us by the willful fortune of war. But it would have been our duty nonetheless. The East is to be opened and transformed whether we will or no. The standards of the West are to be imposed upon it. Nations and peoples which have stood still the centuries through are to be quickened and made part of the universal world of commerce and ideas which has so steadily been a-making by the advance of European power from age to age. It is our peculiar duty, as it is England's, to moderate the process in the interest of liberty, to impart to the peoples thus driven out upon the road of change, teach them order and self-control in the midst of change, impart to them, if it be possible, by contact and by sympathy and example, the drill and habit of law and obedience which we long ago got out of the strenuous processes of English history. In China, of course, our part will be indirect, but in the Philippines, it will be direct. And there, in particular, must the moral of our polity be set up and vindicated. Wilson concluded, we should not hand over to the Filipinos complete individual liberty or the full-fangled institutions of self-government, which would be, quote, a purple garment for their nakedness, not blessings, but a curse to undeveloped peoples still in the childhood of their political growth. 2 years after he published his articles in The Atlantic, Wilson completed a massive 5-volume history of the United States titled A History of the American People. While comprehensive in its coverage of politics and society, it was organized around a central theme, the origins of American character. What was different about his history is that it suppressed the historical importance of disruptive events, most notably war. As character, Wilson argued, was not formed in these ultimately fleeting moments, but was rather constituted by the slow processes by which we grew and made our thought and formed our purpose in quiet days of peace, unquote. The American Revolutionary War, Wilson wrote, had not made a nation, but only freed a group of colonies. It is important to note that Wilson did not view this process of character building as organic. Rather, he described it as one that took place under tutors and masters. Independence then, in Wilson's view, was a habit or temperament passed from England to the United States, and not a political status wrested away from England. By disparaging revolution and by valorizing English colonial rule, Wilson told a history of the United States from the perspective of those once viewed as its oppressors. This was not only a weird and twisted outcome of his pernicious Anglophilia, but also reflects both what his future approach would be to the Philippines and how he might have approached the racial conflicts of the postbellum South. Like many Southerners, Wilson deeply resented the Civil War amendments, viewing them as an infringement upon the principle of self-governance and, worse, placed the South under the ruling thumb of what he called an undeveloped race. Conveniently enough for architecture historians, Wilson's focus on character as a central structuring principle of his political theory was a set of ideas lifted directly from Sir Edmund Burke. Wilson fully subscribed to Burke's trustee model of political representation, a model that relied heavily on the morality and strength of character of government representatives as exceptional and uncorruptible individuals. In this model, elected officials possessed a free mandate to act as they saw fit, even if it meant going against the explicit desires of their constituents. Wilson believed, as Burke did, that trusteeism was especially applicable relative to colonial holdings, where a large percentage of the population were, he believed, unprepared for the freedoms of a liberal democracy. Character, as the foundation of Wilson's political philosophy, was more easily represented than it was translated into colonial or domestic policy. That is why architecture, as something that could itself possess character, was uniquely poised to fulfill Wilson's particular political aims. This point is made bluntly in the illustrated version of A History of the American People. In these illustrations, taken from the same 50-page stretch of the third volume, we see portraits of upstanding Confederate leaders alongside images of the Confederate White House and the residence of Robert E. Lee, succeeded by caricatures of Black American types. And the captions are extremely offensive, and so I won't repeat them here. Architecture is, in a manner somewhat reminiscent of Viollet-le-Duc's pairings of men and their dwellings and habitations of man in all ages, treated as equally representative of race as portraiture. While Doan was aided by the fact that the question of character had been a mainstay of architectural discourse since at least the late 18th century, Doan's charge in the Philippines was far more complex than racial portraiture, architectural or otherwise, as he was asked to represent not the unimpeachable character of a nation, nor even of a colonizer, but of the moral character of a decolonizer. In taking over the Bureau of Public Works architectural division, and we're circling back to Doan here, sorry. Doan had inherited a large, complex, and prolific operation. Doan was a harsh critic of his predecessor, William Parsons, the hand-picked executor of Burnham's plan. Describing Parsons' work as bare and severe, he speculated that this asceticism was probably an antidote for the privileged garish tastes of the native people. This didactic simplicity was, he derogated, wholly out of touch with the prevalent ease of life in the Far East, a misunderstanding of native life that led to a deep satisfaction with Parsons' architecture among Filipinos. Filipinos, Doan elaborated, had grown, quote, accustomed to the lavish Spanish colonial ecclesiastical architecture as their standard. Remarkably, Doan does not make any claim to the universal value of decoration or ornament. Rather, he wrote that architectural policy should be shaped relative to the particular people and nation that it serves. This architectural policy, Doan continued, should be, quote, designed to gain the confidence of the people and their officials in recommendations with respect to the more intangible problems of the future. Problems that must be considered years in advance of their actual realization by producing a current government architecture impressive enough, and it may even be said ostentatious enough, to arouse widespread and general enthusiasm. In other words, Doan's transitional architecture, informed by an ethnographic study of native tastes, was aimed at preempting future conflict with the soon-to-be sovereign nation, with a spectacular display of American largesse. A lasting gratefulness would be the source of an enduring political sway that the United States hoped would last long after the end of colonial sovereignty. To be clear, Doan's ethnographic approach did not mean he viewed his job as a direct translation of native tastes. In general, Doan wrote, according to universally accepted standards, typical Filipino artistic attainments are unsatisfying, unsubstantial, and amount to little more than tinseled claptrap. Doan's intention then was to temper the natives' instinct to ornament and decorate wherever possible. Careful to not ascribe the Filipinos' overzealous decorating to their savagery alone, Doan added that Filipinos' coarse and garish taste was not due to any fundamental deficiency in the people, but rather to the influences by which they have been surrounded. Doan here invoked a common view of ornament as either primitive, regressive, or decadent. However, unlike, say, Corbusier or Los, Doan's disregard for ornament is conditional and is in fact acceptable as a part of a strategy of manufacturing consent. Doan's attack is also not aimed only at Filipinos, but is even more insistently directed at a more primitive colonizer. Like many before him, Doan qualified American colonial fortitude by reproaching Spanish colonial rule. Garishness, according to Doan, was not the only crime the Spanish were guilty of. The local population also vilified Spanish churches on account of the forced labor and extraction of communal wealth required to realize them. The ire of reactionaries, Doan pointed out, was often directed at the churches themselves. This line of criticism, however, turns on a dime, as Doan follows this remark with the observation that Filipinos now regard these huge architectural monuments with the utmost pride and appreciation. Doan's mixed reaction might have been an attempt to ward off some of his own anxieties, as he was well aware of the fact that various forms of prison and corvée labor were employed on most, if not all, of his own projects, a point I will return to soon. Despite Doan's criticism of the Spanish, he was clearly moved by their architecture, a solemn appreciation captured in a series of rendered perspectives of the Manila Cathedral and other Spanish churches. While admitting to their charming color and picturesqueness, these pleasing qualities were, he argued, wholly attributable to having been softened over the decades by surface vegetation, which alleviated their gross proportions and clumsy details. Clumsiness notwithstanding, Doan appreciated the Herculean architectural achievement that the churches represented, especially because they were of greater magnitude than what had been attempted by the Americans. These buildings, or these churches also, he also noted, were hundreds of years old, everywhere, huge, and presented a charm of antiquity that was most impressive. This impressiveness was, of course, not incidental to Spanish rule. The planning of Spanish colonial towns was specifically designed to induce both fear and respect for colonial power. The Leyes de Indias, a 16th century body of laws that attempted to regulate interactions between Spanish settlers and their colonial subjects, specified, for example, that churches should be placed on a plaza, though at a distance from it, and be built on high ground, with a set of steps leading up to it. Setting the church apart spatially in this way was intended to inspire more respect. Burnham's customary use of axial boulevards and large lawns fronting imposing government structures achieved a similar effect. This is all to say that what Doan framed as an architecture of decolonization closely mirrored the programs of both American and Spanish colonial rule. However, unlike the colonial projects that preceded Doan's tenure, Doan's work operated on a newly autonomous plane of culture. That is to say, as separate from legal structures of sovereignty. This was, in other words, an early experiment in the exercise of soft power. By 1916, neoclassicism had become the de facto style of American civic architecture, both in the colony and in the metropole. Indeed, it would be easy enough to consider Doan's work in the Philippines as instances of what Louis Sullivan described as an American neoclassical pandemic, a virus supercharged by Daniel Burnham himself. Burnham, however, did not specify neoclassicism as the official style of his Manila Plan, but instead chose a Spanish mission style, which he chose on account of a desire to maintain a stylistic continuity with what he deemed to be the already charming architecture of America's colonial predecessors. The shift from the Spanish colonial style to neoclassicism actually began to take place before Doan's arrival. While Parsons failed to provide a satisfying rationale for this charge, the shift towards neoclassicism closely tracked political progress made towards national sovereignty. It was, however, left to Doan to make an explicit defense of his use of neoclassical architecture. And here I quote, "America began its history as the Philippines began theirs, without any native architecture, but has legitimately followed ancient and Renaissance precedents, making such adaptations as were necessary to solve American architectural problems. The Philippines might well proceed on the same policy, utilizing the best in classic Renaissance and modern architecture, with the modifications necessary to produce a style eminently suitable to those islands. There is no more logic in refusing to erect buildings of a distinctly American character than there would be in declining to use electricity because of its American derivation." The legitimate use of classical forms conveniently dovetailed with Wilson's culturally hierarchical tutelary scheme. If Filipinos could convincingly reproduce the patterns of their civilizational masters as the United States did theirs, it would serve as a concrete measure of their readiness for independence. It was only after this had been achieved, Doan argued, that a Filipino style, necessarily held in abeyance, should be allowed to emerge. In Doan's words, "The Philippine Islands must go through a long period in which the adaptation of European and American science shall be accomplished before the field of original research is reached. And so in architecture, they must proceed far with the adaptation of foreign architecture and methods of constructions before a distinctly characteristic Filipino style will appear." In other words, neoclassicism was intended to provide a necessary and planned precedent for the later emergence of a more organic nationalism. Thus, it was by design that Doan's provincial capital buildings did not attempt to express an inner spiritual principle of the Philippine nation. His charge, rather, was to legitimize an international ideal to which the Philippines should aspire. The particularities of a neoclassical tradition, not only its origins in Greece and Rome, but its evolution in the United States and France, are here presented as universally applicable signifiers of civilization's progress. Neoclassicism here is deracinated. It is less Greek than it is simply Western, for the very purpose of serving as the logical and superior civilizing structure against which states will eventually distinguish themselves in the form of fully evolved national characteristics. Now, after all of that, let us look more closely at Doan's projects, most of which began construction in 1917. In that year, World War I had reached its nadir. And in April, following a revelation of a German-Mexican conspiracy against the U.S., Wilson reluctantly called upon Congress to declare war on Germany to, as Wilson famously stated, make the world safe for democracy. This is all to say, it is at this particular moment that the United States was under tremendous pressure to demonstrate its anti-imperial culture to the world. While Doan chose neoclassicism precisely because he believed it to be an internationally legitimate style, he still had to prove that as an architecture, it also worked in situ. Here in Doan's provincial capital building in Leyte, he demonstrates the ability of the neoclassical to accommodate local conditions. The long, deep stoa, he pointed out, protected the windows of the building's facade from direct sunlight, while providing a space of repose during tropical wet seasons. Here, Doan also maximized area dedicated to operable windows in order to allow the sea breeze to naturally ventilate the building's interiors. In another provincial capital design, this time in Lingayen, the provincial capital of Pangasinan, Doan borrows more directly from the French neoclassicism. As with many American neoclassical buildings, the front elevation borrows from the general rhythm and massing of Claude Perrault's hugely influential east facade of the Louvre. The rear elevation, which faced the picturesque Lingayen Gulf, more directly referenced James Hoban's Serta-style design for the south portico of the White House. Doan's accommodation of tropical conditions, including large spans of operable windows, didn't interfere with the intended association with Western democratic institutions, an easy connection even if one did not have academic knowledge of the precedents. Whatever the case, the architecture operated effectively on two levels. First, as a gesture directed outwards, as a symbol of institutional stability aimed at a community of former imperial powers, anxious over what a post-imperial world might look like in the aftermath of World War I, and second, as a gesture directed inwards towards a local community of elites promised a position of integrity at the dawn of a new post-colonial order. It was, of course, not enough to design these buildings. Doan had to build them. Doan emphasized that the actual construction of impressive monuments stood in as a partial fulfillment of the promises enshrined in the Jones Law, in that they provided a dignified and physical home for democratic institutions built in anticipation of democracy itself. Realization, however, faced a few obstacles. With the exception of Spanish churches, architecture as decorated and as complex as Doan's was unprecedented on the archipelago. Doan's predecessors avoided most forms of ornamentation in the past not only on account of cost, but on account of a shortage of trained Filipino craftsmen. While certain forms of artisanal labor, including wrought ironwork, capiz shell crafting, and wood carving, were common throughout the archipelago, there was little experience with the decorative trades most often associated with reinforced concrete construction, namely clay modeling and ornamental casting. Posing an even more serious obstacle to Doan was that he had to simultaneously oversee the construction of dozens of projects spread across the archipelago. On account of this particular problem, Doan had no option but to centralize. He began by assembling a cadre of dedicated tradesmen, a special corps of 50 or 60 sculptors and molders who would all be based in Manila. Most Filipino artists working in the building trade already lived in Manila on account of the concentration of ecclesiastical institutions, which had always generated a need for skilled artisans, and on account of the establishment by the Spanish in 1890 of the School of Arts and Trades in Manila. Most of the sculptors that Doan hired had either taught or received some training there. Doan arranged the artisans into a number of ateliers and placed them under the direct supervision and employment of the Bureau of Public Works Architectural Division. Centralizing the production of architectural ornament meant that Doan could work on multiple buildings throughout the archipelago without ever having to leave the capital city. In those workshops, Doan worked directly with artisans to develop applied decoration in three-dimensional detail. Upon completion, the building parts would be shipped off for installation at various sites across the archipelago. This, of course, was not a new way of working. Dignifying industrial architecture with decorative finishes and applied sculpture was a method already perfected by Burnham at the Columbian Exposition. Whereas director of works, Burnham employed legions of artists, grouping them on fairgrounds and studios cramped with gargantuan plaster bodies, which artists began to work on even as the steel skeletons of the fair continued to be erected. This method of working was heavily criticized by leading architectural critics like Montgomery Schuyler and Lewis Mumford as reducing architecture to a practice of specification in which ornamental plaster was charged with ameliorating the discomforting expression of architecture's industrial manufacture. Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright famously criticized Burnham for dismembering an architectural body that should be conceived as an integrated and organic whole. What Sullivan and Schuyler viewed as a sort of architectural death was in Burnham's eyes, presented new organizational possibilities and would allow the corporate architect to not only work at a distance from the job site and at multiple job sites at once, but to also complete buildings at an unprecedented pace. Just as was Just as was the case at the exposition, this division of work sites allowed Doan to separate the building into two distinct managerial tasks. The first was the construction of the building's main structure, which was designed to be as standardized as possible, and the second task was to directly supervise fabrication shops and ateliers in Manila, a situation that allowed Doan to maximize a sort of character-endowing variation. The advantages of centralization were fully realized in the construction of the Pangasinan Capitol building, the most striking feature of which was its colossal order of columns, which at 27 feet tall would be the largest columns ever fabricated in the Philippines. When Doan's atelier completed the columns, they were sent along with their ornate capitals to travel 220 kilometers north, arriving to the site in perfect condition. Their installation took on the appearance of a coronation of sorts, dramatizing the building's rapid construction. The establishment of Doan's centralized ateliers was not only a reflection of a more ambitious architecture, but also of the changed goals of the insular government under Wilson and Francis Burton Harrison, who was Wilson's appointee as Governor General. One of the most important, though uncelebrated, motivations for the Burnham Plan, and a distinct focus of the previous Republican administrations, was the stimulation of a private construction industry. As such, before Doan's arrival, it was rare for the insular government to directly manage their capital projects. However, on account of the challenges presented by Doan's designs, no private firms in Manila were willing to attempt the work. And when they did submit bids, the cost was prohibitively out of reach. Because of this, Doan resorted to an arrangement called building by administration, which simply meant that the Bureau of Public Works would directly manage every aspect of construction, sourcing all of its own labor and materials. While this did little, of course, for the building industry, there were distinct advantages to this arrangement, including the opportunity to raise the general level of architectural production on the archipelago through the direct management of labor. This arrangement also allowed Doan to argue for the liberating effects of American building practice, a fantasy in which the craftsman's work is celebrated while hard labor is consigned to machines. If one were to look exclusively at Doan's ateliers, it might be easy to be convinced of this particular argument. This fantasy, however, quickly dissolves at the work site. One of the key advantages of building by administration, from the perspective of labor costs, was the ability to take advantage of a very large labor pool then under the direct management of the American administration, and that is prison labor. This was one of the key means of controlling the cost of Doan's architecture. Just as Doan's cadre of artisans carefully carved the volutes and semi-tropical flourishes in Manila, in Pangasinan, the grading of site grounds, the pouring of foundations, and other low-skilled tasks were executed by a gang of prisoners. Certainly, Doan was not the first to do this. In fact, his predecessor considered the use of prison labor on provincial capitals a necessary condition for their successful construction. In William Parsons' words, where there is prison labor, good soil, good drainage, and a supply of water in the dry season, the conditions are ideal for completing provincial capitol buildings. Whatever the case, Doan failed to distinguish his own labor practices from those of his supposedly less enlightened predecessors, as he too was dependent on prison labor to produce his architecture. Here, I will circle back to Doan's artificial stone that we saw at the top of the lecture. As Doan tells the story, the idea for the stone was one that suddenly struck him on a visit to his first work site in Iloilo City, about 700 kilometers south of Manila. While traveling to the site, he spotted a pile of crushed aggregate that he described as white as a pile of sugar, being mixed into a concrete slurry for a road construction project. He openly lamented that that stone of such a quality was destined to be entombed in dull gray cement. He was, however, unable to use the stone for his project in Iloilo, a custom house that was already near completion. In a fortuitous turn, several months later, on a visit to the site of the Pangasinan Capitol building, Doan caught wind of an American mining speculator's discovery of unlimited qualities of a marble almost resembling Botticino, only 40 kilometers away from the building site. Following a visit to the new quarry, Doan observed that though deposits were large enough to obtain both slabs and blocks, the quarries were, quote, so underdeveloped as to make it impossible to obtain stone ashlar veneers for concrete walls. Doan then settled for aggregate. which would be extracted and processed in much the same way that all other aggregates on the island were, with some combination of mechanical rock crushers and prison labor. Prison labor was also used in the artisanal finishing of Doane's prismatic stone, which, despite being conceived of as a cheap and efficient way to incorporate a more luxurious finish, turned out to be a highly specialized and laborious method. Countless experiments eventually yielded a process that involved two separate pours of two different classes of concrete, the bulk of which would be mixed with the standard gravel aggregate, while the top 3 inches containing the white marble aggregate would be poured into a special galvanized iron mold in front of that layer. That finish would then be carefully bush hammered on site. As Doane specified this special concrete for all of his monumental projects, he resolved to train a special gang of prison laborers for this work and used on this work only. This special gang would travel from job site to job site, ensuring the same level of quality could be achieved across the archipelago. For Doane, the efforts and moral compromises were well worth it. The stone amended what he felt to be the objectionable appearance of concrete, which, as if you'll remember, he characterized as an artistically bastard material. His glittering stone held the promise of reconciling American efficiency with a noble and legitimizing material expression. Indeed, it was an astonishingly capacious symbol, speaking not only through its territorial specificity, but also by animating the building's entire surface by reflecting in the exposed facets of Alaminos marble what Doane described as the gorgeous colorings of the island's tropical sun. And here it is worth quoting in full some of Doane's fulsome and poetic descriptions. The tropical Philippine sun is a more gorgeous sun by far than is ever seen in the temperate climes. The low-lying solar displays of the temperate zone that seem to hug the horizon so close are tame in comparison. A sunset seen from New York looks as if it was really taking place in San Francisco. But in equatorial regions, the sun sets right where one happens to be. Great banks of fluffy white clouds sail up from the immediate horizons, high into the heaven, and lighted by flashing golden shafts and played upon by a galaxy of colors gorgeous beyond description, seem to form a gigantic canopy of nature's most marvelous stuff, shutting out all the cold world beyond and producing effects which are of great importance in architectural design. By capturing the rays of the Philippine sun, Doane's artificial stone was not merely a material, but acted more insistently as a medium, one that used a newly discovered natural resource to mediate the archipelago's spectacular celestial phenomena. Doane took special pleasure in pointing out the fact that while the stone was native to the Philippines, it was not known to the Filipinos before American colonization. The tropical sun never appeared as beautiful as when refracted through the prism of American development. By specifying a material discovered and developed by Americans, Doane found an opportunity to not only dignify concrete construction with a local material of exceptional quality, but also to make an argument that American assistance was needed in order to develop untapped Philippine assets. There was, however, trouble brewing in this seemingly perfect admixture. World War I exerted dramatic effects on the Philippine economy. Among these was the astronomical surge in the price of coal, which in February of 1917 rose nearly 550% from 11 to 60 pesos per ton. Accordingly, the purchase price of cement, a material that required large amounts of coal in its process of manufacture, also spiraled out of control. These economic disturbances forced Governor General Harrison to realize the colony's dangerous dependence on foreign goods. Before the war, there was little incentive to develop the cement industry in the Philippines, as high levels of global production kept cement prices low. Thus, while it was long known that the materials for an excellent grade of cement existed in the Philippines, cement production was never pursued. To address this instability, Harrison initiated a series of ambitious development projects, a process that began by placing both new and key existing Philippine industries under some degree of government control. He invented a new type of administrative body, which he called government auxiliaries. Just one example of these auxiliaries was the National Cement Company, which was established in 1920. The plan, as conceived by Harrison, involved luring a prominent American cement man to put up the plant with government money, giving him the right to purchase at the end of a certain date under a perpetual contract to furnish cement to the government at cost plus 10%. This partnership was expected to save the government enough money per year to equal the whole amount of capital originally invested by it. While government ownership and interference with the market flew in the face of American free market orthodoxy, This manipulation was argued for on the grounds of stabilizing the Philippine economy, a necessary precondition for the Philippines' participation as an independent member in a society of nations. Transitioning the Philippines towards independence was here conceived as a tutelage of an elite group of Filipino managers guided by the technical expertise of American corporate leaders. Harrison describes the purpose of these auxiliaries as simply creating an opportunity for the development of native captains of industry. It is in this way that Doan's artificial stone was thoroughly nationalized, though it was a nationalization that from the start was embedded in the emerging formalizations of an internationalist system of capitalist trusts. That is to say, while Philippine national architecture would be cast out of a concrete presented as wholly Filipino, this never precluded the generation of profits for American capitalists. As Doan had hoped, Pangasinan's Capitol building was popular amongst the local population and is in fact considered an architectural wonder of sorts. Though Doan left the Philippines before the completion of the project, he claimed that it had already inspired the pride and interest of the community in which it was located, and seemed to demonstrate that the Filipino people were willing to forgo the shoddy gaudiness of Spanish standards for the more substantial and satisfying results of legitimate American architecture. As I have already suggested, what this architecture was attempting to legitimize were the emerging structures of international rule. Indeed, Doan was able to deliver a perfect symbol to both Harrison and to Wilson, who were eager to demonstrate a moral example of a decolonization process that would apparently and simultaneously satisfy the desires of both native nationalists eager for symbolic gains and American and foreign capitalists who would have been comforted by signs of stability. In presenting the decolonization of the Philippines as exemplary, Doan's architecture mirrored the central aims of the Wilson and Harrison administration, as articulated in Harrison's book, The Cornerstone of Philippine Independence. And here one should not fail to notice that Harrison chose an architectural metaphor as the book's title. In Harrison's words, "However proud the white races may be of gazing upon the map and watching the spread of their empires, the fact remains that the whole of continental Asia is seething with discontent toward the European conqueror. About 750 million people who inhabit these territories are kindling into fury against the white race on account of the European theory of colonization. While they point to individual instances of injustice and rapacity, the main burden of their complaint is that Europe had no right to annex their countries. There is now a hope that with the new dispensation of world affairs, these questions may come to be discussed openly and without reserve. When the day arrives for this momentous change in our modern system, the United States of America, because of her policy in the Philippines, can come into court with clean hands." The capital of Pangasinan was thus intended to be far more than a symbol of local pride. It was a representation of the post-colonial nation-state as a moral American creation. As Arez Manela put it, the successful tutelage of Filipinos and the eventual granting to them of their independence was more than an issue of domestic interest. It was also a practical test of American ideals and principles conducted before a global audience. As I hope I've demonstrated here, washing American hands clean of historical forms of colonialism was part of an attempt to conceal that the process of American withdrawal from the Philippines was also structured as an expansion of American power. No one realized this more clearly than Doan, who framed his work in the Philippines not as the conclusion of a colonial project, but rather as the beginning of one. And I quote Doan here, "Here lies our first opportunity as a great nation to inaugurate a real colonial architecture. The Philippine Islands afford an inspirational field that would not fail to interest in ordinary times, much less in these strange days when our sympathies have broadened and our considerations easily reach the uttermost parts of the civilized world." Doan's mastery of Wilson's neocolonial rhetoric is truly remarkable. More importantly for our purposes, what this statement demonstrates is that Doan understood the value of his architecture to be the central part that it played in the realization not of Philippine independence, but of an expanding American imperial influence. By real colonial architecture, Doan did not mean an architecture that was verifiably colonial. By real, Doan meant a legitimate form of colonialism. Clarifying what he meant by this, Doan argued that an American sponsorship of architectural beauty revealed the uniquely progressive and even moral nature of American colonialism. with his architecture, Doan offered to posterity a sparkling pedestal through which an increasingly abstract power managed an experience of decolonization. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that wonderful talk. Just to remind everyone, we are collecting questions on cards that you can pass to our staff members. But just to begin, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how this relates to Wilson and his experience of Reconstruction, to start us off.
So when I was writing this chapter, I was when I was working on this chapter, it was right around the time when Princeton was considering, or when there was a movement to remove Wilson's name off of the School of Public Policy and International Affairs at Princeton, an ultimately successful campaign. And one of the and though I agree with I think the move to remove his name, the thing I didn't like about it was that it sort of played into this idea that there were two Wilsons, a sort of Wilson who was a good Wilson, right? The not bigoted Wilson. The Wilson who was the author of the League of Nations and a sort of precursor to the UN, or the League of Nations. But and then there was another Wilson, the Wilson who was quoted in The Birth of a Nation, right? And what I want to argue is that I want to make an epistemological argument here, that this is the same Wilson, that we need to understand his own work in international relations as coming from the same system of thought that produced his racist thinking with regards to how he felt about Reconstruction. And so in a way, we can almost think of sort of his resegregation of civil service positions in the United States, or we can rethink the League of Nations as a sort of, in some ways, a scaled up version of a resegregated government.
So I have a question from an online grad student. Okay. What brought about your interests in these topics? And it's a triple question. And what/how did these interests push you forward in your academic career?
That's a good question. So I knew I wanted to do a project on the American colonization of the Philippines. There had been very little written on the topic when I decided to pursue my PhD. And this is expressly the reason why I decided to pursue a PhD, was to tell the story. Because what had been written was all written by Thomas Hines, and I was a little unsatisfied with what he had written, important as it was as a starting point. But then when I started, when I started research in earnest, it's just what I wrote is what I found, and it's kind of incredible that it's just never, that it sort of these archival resources have just never, been spoken about at length, or analyzed in a sort of way that I found satisfying, and I don't know that I was thinking about it sort of relative to the progress of my own career, but I really have, maybe this sounds so Pollyanna-ish of me, but it was really about the pursuit of this idea and being able to tell this story that really propelled me forward.
Earlier you mentioned the League of Nations, and I was wondering, how do you compare Doan's architecture to kind of other forms of international architecture that are happening kind of simultaneously or after?
It's a really good question. So, I don't know if you can put the image of the PowerPoint up again. So actually a building that I find really understudied actually in architectural history is the Palace of the League of Nations, like as it was actually built. You know, for some reason we know Corbusier's sort of unbuilt design for the League of Nations and several other designs for the Palace of the League of Nations far better than we know what was actually built. And in many ways, I would argue that this is a precedent for what is actually built in the League of Nations, in that what Doan was trying to do was develop a neoclassicism that was somewhere, between a decorated architecture and a sort of starved classicism. Remember, it was important to temper the desire to decorate, but to also satisfy a sort of need for the Filipinos to see a decorated architecture. So, so this architecture would be more decorated than the Palace of the League of Nations. And of course, this is long before the sort of monergism takes hold, and they, finally sort of kowtow to Corbusier's desires to build a thoroughly modern UN.
All right, we've got lots of questions coming in. So, concerning the question of style, could critical regionalism be considered a political theorizing of neocolonialism coming into or maybe out of modern architecture with clean hands?
Ooh. Oh. Could critical regionalism...
Yeah, let me just read it. Concerning the question of style, could critical regionalism be considered a political theorizing of neocolonialism coming into or maybe out of modern architecture with clean hands?
I'm not exactly sure how to answer that one. This is not, the architect, if we can throw the PowerPoint up again, Doan's architecture, if you go, I'm not, here I'm going by Kenneth Frampton's definition rather than Zonas and Lefebvre's of critical regionalism. In some ways, this actually can be described as, if I'm understanding the question correctly, this almost can be described as a sort of critical regionalism, in the sense that there is a sort of character-giving specificity, but there's still a sort of, let's say, a resort to, or not resort to, the use of modern systems of construction. But the difference here, I think, is that there isn't a use of autochthonous forms as Kenneth Frampton would put it. Interestingly, he tries to use forms that are sort of vaguely connected to the Philippine context, like the eagle is supposed to be the Lingayen eagle, or the Philippine eagle. And there's a shell motif which is supposed to represent its position on the coast, on the ocean. There's also some native fruits that are abstracted and incorporated into the architecture. But these are, for the most part, not autochthonous forms, but autochthonous themes. And so, no, like maybe 10, I think Ken would maybe roll his eyes if if we called this critical regionalism. So I don't know if it's an appropriate label to place on this.
Great talk. I'm quoting here, but also great talk. What about structural concrete? Structural concrete, did that pose special problems?
Structural concrete. As opposed to, I mean, the concrete here is structural. I mean, one of the things I talked about is that, that the special concrete was actually like a veneer of 3 inches placed in front of the first concrete pour. But yes, it was all very structural. And in fact, this is all. Interestingly, I mean, this was a building, were many of the provincial capital buildings, a building severely damaged during World War II. But interestingly, like the only thing that was damaged was the sort of layer of decorative concrete, of ornamental concrete in front, and so they were able to very easily patch it up. And there was no, there was significant structural damage to many of these buildings, but to this one there was not.
The next 2 questions I think are related in some ways. Can your research inform our understanding of Asian and Pacific islands still colonized and governed by the U.S. today and their colonial architecture?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can. I mean, one of a sort of piece that, I actually have an image of it here. Montgomery Schuyler actually wrote this, oh no, not that one. Wrote this piece in the Architectural Review called Our Acquired Architecture. And this is a really fascinating piece, and he actually starts, he goes over the architecture of Cuba, of Hawaii, and of the Philippines. And, with the exception of Hawaii, Cuba and the Philippines, of course, like have this sort of, have the shared history of Spanish colonization. But, his general approach to the acquisition not only of territory but of architecture is a really, it's a really interesting lens through which to think of, how does identity get sort of folded into, or how should it be folded into our larger American identity? I mean, this is like, this is something that sort of also plays out in terms of a question that also plays out in terms of citizenship. Is this architecture too foreign to think of as American? And again, like the analog with, are the subjects of former colonial, of these colonial territories too foreign to be American? And so, yeah, I think there is something to be had with the, there is a connection, I think.
Kind of in that vein, how do you engage, I guess, in your scholarship with intergenerational memory?
That's an interesting one, and it's a good question. I mean, I think about this a lot because I am Filipino, and I think about this especially sort of with the last chapter of my book, which is on military fortifications. I was born in Riverside, California, and the reason I was born there is because there's an Air Force base there. My dad was military, like many, many Filipinos, seeking a path to citizenship. It was this sort of special path to citizenship for Filipinos. And that, it's not just that moment. I think every chapter I write, I find something that is related to, to my family's past. There's a chapter on schools, and the school that my grandmother taught in was one of the schools that was built during William Parsons' tenure. And so in many ways, I feel that I'm always engaging or having a conversation, a sort of intergenerational conversation with my work, if that makes any sense.
No, definitely makes sense. I think, did the work of these architects, or what impact, if any, on the work of these architects have on that of post-colonial architects that also worked mostly with concrete, both kind of structurally and aesthetically?
Okay, one more time, sorry.
No, sorry. What impact, if any, did the work of these architects working in concrete have on that of the post-colonial architects that also worked mostly with concrete, both structurally and aesthetically?
Yeah, so it's a very direct relationship. In fact, I mentioned briefly that that there were many Filipino architects who were trained in American institutions, who were working at the Bureau of Public Works, sort of as apprentices to the American architects. And so it was a direct, tutelary relationship. And in fact, that most of the architecture that I look at, that you can trace a direct line always back to Parsons or Doan. Like all of the architects that I write about, and in the next chapter, all of the American architects evacuate. The Bureau of Public Works is properly Filipinized, and those who are left are the American-trained Filipino architects who worked under Doan and Parsons. So yes, in terms of what the style would look like, that's an interesting question, because Juan Arellano, who is actually the main figure in my next chapter, he starts off making architecture that looks like this. It's basically just like Doan's architecture, except it is occupied with these sort of heroic Filipino figures. And that is the main difference between the neoclassical architecture of the Filipino architects and their predecessors. But then what happens is Juan Arellano, who was the architect of the legislative building, this is the pediment of the legislative building, just as sort of Doan says he should, he starts to pursue a sort of organic Philippine style. This sort of starts off as an Art Deco style, because he visits the United States many times, and he picks up on the sort of on the stylistic trends. And Art Deco is a particularly easy way of incorporating decorative motifs that are, distinctively Filipino, and while working in modern materials, modern industrialized materials. And so, but then he starts also experimenting with more autochthonous forms, right? So he kind of moves towards the sort of critical regionalism it becomes an eventual pursuit of the Filipino architects.
So thinking also kind of a longer time span, architectural history in particular has assembled kind of many histories of concrete. Mm-hmm. How does the Philippines case kind of alter the history of concrete that unfolds throughout the 20th century?
I mean, that's a really good question, and it's one that I actually am tackling right now in my introduction to my book that I'm trying to complete. I think the Philippines tells a story that gets repeated over and over again. I mean, and in some way, in some ways, the story it has to tell in manner of its specificities is unique. Specifically because of the unique colonial relationship it has with the United States. But in other ways, it's absolutely not distinct. I mean, it is the sort of portability of concrete that allows certain technological advances and architectural advancements that happen everywhere in the world, that happen, let's say, in the metropole, to happen simultaneously in the colony, right? And so, in a sense, like that is the actual, the agency of concrete is that you can achieve a certain level of building quality pretty much anywhere. And so it's an actual agent of globalization in that sense. And then, so while I tell a story that I feel is, reveals certain particular and unique aspects of American colonization and globalization, I do think it is a story that is ultimately global.
Another question: were Filipino architects expected to kind of take up Doan's neoclassicism? I'm thinking, this person is thinking of the Manila Central Post Office, which looks a lot like his provincial capitals.
Yes. So the question was?
The question was, yes. So the question was, were Filipino architects expected to take up Doan's neoclassicism?
Yeah.
Question mark. I'm thinking of the Manila Central Post Office, which looks a lot like his provincial capitals.
Yes, so the Manila Central Post Office actually was started by Doan, even though it's credited to Juan Arellano, who along with another Filipino architect named Tomas Mapua, became the first Filipino consulting architects. It's sorry, if you can go back. Absolutely, there was an expectation. Well, I don't know if it was so much expected. Ralph Harrington Doan actually started several projects that were finished by Filipinos. And so this series of projects looked very much like Ralph Harrington Doan's initial designs, but they were redesigned. They were elaborated even further, and as I mentioned, they were occupied then and decorated with these sort of heroic figures of Filipinos. And that was not the case in Ralph Harrington Doan's versions of these buildings. And so, yeah, to a certain extent, they just continued the work of Ralph Harrington Doan, and it was the way all of these Filipino architects had Beaux-Arts educations. So yeah, I mean, that is the way they were going to design. But as I mentioned, there was a move away from it in this sort of pursuit of the Filipino soul. Like this is something that was anticipated by Doan and something that certainly the architects did eventually pursue.
Any final questions from the audience? Oh, yes.
Oh. Yeah, what happened to these buildings? That's, okay, great question. So one of the things, there's this image and this image go together. This is was sort of a teaser for like the next, or my final chapter. So this is the provincial capital of Leyte. And if you guys know that there's a famous photo, I wish I had it here, of Douglas MacArthur wading towards the shore during the invasion to liberate the Philippines. And what isn't shown is that he was looking directly at this building during that invasion. Like he was looking essentially at a sort of American, like a sort of architecture looked very much American. And this was a ceremony after the conclusion of the Battle of Leyte, sort of formally handing over control back to the Philippines. Like, the Japanese did not surrender after this moment, but in any event, it was important for him to stage this event. Many of these buildings were destroyed during World War II, as I mentioned, but sort of one of the last things that the Americans did as they withdrew after World War II was to promise to rebuild everything that the Americans had built. And so, but especially in Manila, in the capital, these buildings were built back cheaper, simpler, and uglier, and they had to paint over the decorative artificial stone that Doan labored over intensively with paint, and so you can't see that surface anymore. It doesn't exist because they didn't bother to replace it. They patched it up with just regular cement and painted it. So yeah, you can still see almost all of these buildings. They are all reconstructed, but they do not look as they used to.
Well, on that note, thank you so much again. And as a final note, as our fall lecture series continues, please join us next Thursday as we welcome architects Todd Williams and Billy Sin. Their presentation, Defiant Optimism, will focus on their work for the Obama Presidential Center, Mistakes Made, Lessons Learned, and Future Hopes. As always, this lecture will be hosted both in person and online. Thanks.